Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for coming. It is truly a pleasure to be here. So I have to say this isn't really a research talk. It's more of an extended meditation that sort of turns into a manifesto. So we'll see how that goes. But I hope ultimately to maybe engage us all in a little conversation as opposed to just have a statement of things that I've done. It's not really things that I've done, but things that I am thinking, starting to come to think. So I'm going to begin with a little story. On January 21st, 2017, I attended the Women's March in Raleigh, North Carolina, one of many marches that day across the United States, and scheduled for the day after the presidential inauguration. The march was meant to repudiate sexist, racist, and anti-immigrant sentiments associated with the Trump campaign. And these women also participated in the march wearing signs that read, "Librarians for Facts." At the march, it seemed quite clear what Librarians for Facts meant. In the weeks before the inauguration, the news media had begun reporting on widely promulgated false stories or fake news and the influence that those stories might have had on the election. Furthermore, the previous day, the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, had made erroneous claims about the size of the inauguration crowd, claiming that it was the largest audience ever for an inauguration without proof to support that contention. And the day after the march, White House senior staffer Kellyanne Conway would tell Chuck Todd on Meet the Press that Spicer had merely employed alternative facts to those produced by the press corps. So the Librarians for Facts appeared to affirm their profession's continued adherence to facts in a traditional sense, information that is accepted as true, for which proofs can be established according to generally agreed standards of evidence. And at the march, I of course cheered the idea of Librarians for Facts. Whatever one's political leanings, couldn't we all coalesce around the idea that one should have a solid evidentiary basis for one's statements? That seems like such a simple, fundamental condition for rational discourse. How could anyone in good faith be against facts? Woo, Librarians for Facts. But later that week, as I began preparing introductory lectures for an undergraduate course in Foundations of Information Science, or INLS 201, I found myself returning to the notion of Librarians for Facts and getting a little uneasy. What did that slogan really mean? Was I for facts? What are facts anyway? So for one of my first class sessions, I had assigned an introduction to the concept of information as written by the philosopher Luciano Floridi. And Floridi reserves the word information for semantic factual data, or data that can be proven true. Accordingly, statements for which truth claims aren't relevant might be meaningful, but they aren't information as such in the way that Floridi understands information. So instructional statements, such as a recipe for delicious muffins, are not information for Floridi. An instructional statement might be meaningful, but it's neither true nor false. Fiction is not information either. It might be meaningful, but it's not true. The distinction that information is restricted to facts is important for Floridi because only information can lead to knowledge. So whatever meaningful experience you might have looking at an abstract expressionist painting, that experience doesn't lead to knowledge. Only information begets knowledge. So if we accept Floridi's understanding of information, then Librarians for Facts would be for statements that can be established as true. Now, there are many objections to Floridi's account. One objection is pragmatic. The activities of information professionals are clearly not limited to statements that can be proven to be true. So from the perspective of the information professions, limiting information to facts is insufficient. And then there is the capacity of untrue content to nonetheless inform. Technically, of course, a novel might indeed be just a bunch of lies, and yet it doesn't seem weird at all to think of a novel as also being informative of the human experience. Part of why we read and study fiction is precisely because of its capacity to help us comprehend the experiences of people who are not us. Still, it does seem that novels inform differently than, say, encyclopedias. We might learn something true about the human condition from reading Hamlet, but we also need to understand that Hamlet is not the same as Danish history. So perhaps factual statements should be distinguished from other kinds of meaningful content. Perhaps they should have a special status. And maybe this is what librarians for facts really meant. That librarians should clarify which statements are true and which statements are not. Okay, so what is this difference? What kind of statements are true and therefore facts and therefore information? As an example of a true proposition, Floridi uses Paris is the capital of France. In contrast, Paris is the capital of Canada would be false. Paris is the capital of Canada, fact. Paris is the capital of, wait, did I say that right? Paris is the capital of France, fact. Paris is the capital of Canada, not a fact. Perhaps we can imagine librarians for facts making similar distinctions. So similarly, Vancouver is in Canada, true. Vancouver is in France, false. Vancouver is in France, not a fact. Vancouver is in Canada, fact. But we're in British Columbia, and we know that there are other perspectives, as Julia just indicated, quite valid perspectives under which Vancouver is in Canada is contested or even not true. So here at UBC, we might say that the real fact is that Vancouver is located on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Most of the world recognizes Vancouver as being in Canada, but some, including the Vancouver municipal government, question the legitimacy of this claim. So are both these propositions facts and both true, even though to some extent they contradict each other? These kinds of complex situations are, of course, not limited to political issues. So even something that seems as scientific and straightforward as Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on the planet, that equally seems like a fact. But the truth of this proposition depends on the scale of measurement used to establish height. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain based on elevation from sea level. However, measuring from the center of the Earth produces a different answer. Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador. And this is because the Earth bulges around the equator. So Chimborazo is the furthest point from the center of the Earth, but not the furthest point from sea level. Does this mean that Everest is the tallest mountain is not a fact? Well, that seems a little bit squishy. We might just say instead that different measurement scales are useful for different purposes, and measurement from sea level is certainly an appropriate scale for many human interests in mountains, such as climbing them. Climbing Everest is notoriously difficult and dangerous, while climbing Chimborazo is not. Measurement from the center of the Earth, on the other hand, is useful for other things, certain calculations, other human interests. To debate which measurement is more true than the other measurement is meaningless. They're useful for different purposes. Now, surely, though, it's easier to decide whether values for a particular defined characteristic are accurate in the sense of, is our measurement correct, or have we made some error in taking the measurement, applying the scale, or interpreting the result? We would never agree that Everest is merely 2,000 feet over sea level, or that Vancouver is in France. So perhaps librarians for facts is really clarifying accuracy rather than truth. Accuracy should be easier to agree on and less situationally determined, right? So Here's a teaching example that I find illustrative in this regard. Users of online dating services are asked to describe various personal characteristics for their profiles. Often, dating services employ controlled vocabularies for these characteristics to enable systematic searching and sorting of potential dates. One characteristic that often uses one of these vocabularies is body type. Although the vocabularies across services are similar, they employ slightly different values. And here are a few examples of these body type vocabularies from OkCupid, Dharma Match, and Soul Geek. So when I ask students in my classes to think about how they would select a value in these dating vocabularies, they realize that body type in this context is only partly about what you look like. It's also about the self-image that you want to project to others. Are you the kind of person who describes herself as curvaceous, a few extra pounds, or big gal? Accuracy in this context is quite nuanced. It's kind of like, well, I want you to know that I think of myself as curvaceous, and my actual physique clearly only has partial bearing on the accuracy of this measurement. If it even pertains at all. Under what circumstances might someone justifiably complain, for example, that a selection that you made would be wrong? If I select large and my body mass index is under 20, would that be wrong? What if I think I'm large no matter what my BMI says? When we consider this example, one of the interesting realizations is that alternate forms of data collection, ones that we might initially think of as inherently more accurate, don't seem to actually make a lot of sense. Say, having a panel of independent raters select your body type value based on your picture. Or having other users select your value after you've dated them. When I posit such alternatives in class, everyone groans. Wouldn't using independent raters be more accurate, I ask? Well, no, because independent raters can't guess my self-image from looking at me. The body type example also illuminates how more objective or factual forms of measurement clearly don't convey the same information. Entering one's height, weight, and the circumference of various body parts is really a different characteristic entirely than the idea of body type expressed by these vocabularies. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, though, accuracy is equally fraught in this kind of scenario. So students often remark that self-reported quantitative measurements in the dating contest are likely going to be lies, or at the very least, optimistically true statements, as in, well, this is what I weighed once that time last winter when I was sick with the flu and didn't eat for 3 days. And yet, when I suggest the increasingly available possibility of automatic, continually updated quantitative measurements based on sensor data, like in your bathroom scale or in the waistband of your pants, all courtesy of the Internet of Things, everyone thinks this is absolutely terrible. No one wants that kind of accuracy to be displayed about themselves or even to know about it for other people. That kind of accuracy is just wrong. It doesn't align with the situation. It's too much accuracy. So to me, what this example demonstrates is that accuracy is not universal, just like truth is not universal. The data collection protocols and forms of evidence that seem valid, reliable, and correct in one context aren't necessarily so in another. For online dating, scientific standards of objective measurement are neither appropriate nor accurate. To impose those standards upon the online dating context would be weird and terrible. And indeed, the decision to use objective measurement in any case is of necessity a subjective one. That is, it's situationally dependent and not universally valid. When we think about these examples, librarians for facts doesn't seem to be on firm ground. Arguing about which situationally dependent perspective is more true is not going to produce a clear result, which explains how accusations of fake news can be labeled by anyone about anything and how I know you are, but what am I, has become the basic level of political discourse in the United States. So as a counterpoint to Floridi's discussion of information, the readings for that first week of INLS 201 also included a 1995 article by Phil Agri that envisioned the future of librarianship in a world of digital libraries. So Phil Agri was a visionary artificial intelligence scholar who criticized the foundational assumptions of that discipline and then realized he could no longer be a part of it. Agri wound up in the information school at UCLA, and he wrote wonderfully prescient things about privacy and surveillance and the possibility of a critical technical practice, and he also wrote this piece about librarianship. Agri observes that within the profession of librarianship, information has traditionally been described as a context-independent, university-valid substance, rather like Floridi's understanding of information as facts. For Agri, this way of defining information performs as a strategic bit of professional ideology for librarians. By orienting their profession around information, librarians could claim to serve all users equally, maintaining an air of professional impartiality and objectivity. While this ideology has served the profession well in the past, Agri argues 20 years ago that the forms of information access created under this ideology can easily be taken over by computers. We don't actually need librarians to provide access to facts. Computers will be able to do that just as well. And anyway, for Agri, it's better for librarians to give up this ideology of information. Agri argues that the idea of information as a context-independent, universally valid substance is conceptually impoverished. When we think about how scholarly disciplines actually come to accept certain data as both meaningful and true, it's not in some context-free vacuum, but within the documentary traditions of their communities of practice. So for Agri, information only emerges within the documents or literatures produced by those communities. As articulated by genre theorists such as Yates and Orlikowski, the structural, formal, stylistic, and other conventions of literatures, which Agri calls their institutional circuitry, provide the conditions under which information comes to be true within a literature. We might also describe the institutional circuitry as the conditions under which facts are made and accepted as such. So, for example, it's within the institutional circuitry of data science that cinematic taste is defined as the selections made in one's Netflix profile. Within the institutional circuitry of film studies, cinematic taste is articulated differently. Not just what is watched, for example, but how, with what form of attention. And Agri imagines a future where librarians provide access to literatures, like data science or film studies, rather than information. So in Agri's vision, librarians would create distinct access mechanisms for particular configurations of institutional circuitry. So what does that actually mean? Well, Agri's conception of what this would look like is kind of vague. I can imagine 3 different interpretations of what we might call librarians for institutional circuitry, and I'll briefly sketch out what those 3 are. So in the first one, librarians would create access mechanisms that align with the institutional circuitry of particular literatures. So a concept like cinematic taste would be defined and used to group and relate documents in one way for the literature of data science, and in another way for the literature of film studies. In another way of understanding this, librarians would elucidate and compare institutional circuitry. So librarians would actually explain what cinematic taste means in data science and what it means in film studies and clarify the differences between them. And in yet another interpretation, librarians would examine and critique institutional circuitry. So librarians would create access mechanisms that interrogate what it means to define cinematic taste in data science and cinematic taste in film studies, and explore the implications of defining cinematic taste in those ways. So just as an example of this, I don't know about you, but what my Netflix profile records is actually a complicated negotiation between me and my partner regarding what might be minimally acceptable material for both of us, as complemented by totally different decisions when one of us happens to be alone for the evening. So when we're both at home, we watch science fiction that isn't terrible, like Dark Matter. When he's away, I watch European crime shows like Broadchurch or Shetland. And when I'm gone, he watches stuff that I can't even fathom, like Roman Empire. What is that? All of this together is what data science aggregates as the cinematic taste of my Netflix profile. So librarians would interrogate what it means to define cinematic taste in this and other ways. All three of the possibilities suggested by Egri's discussion would provide alternate understandings of librarians for facts. Instead of making universal pronouncements about truth value, librarians for facts might either, option 1, determine facts for a particular context. So in context A, Vancouver is in Canada. In context B, Vancouver is on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Or, option 2, librarians would describe conditions under which facts might be established. So this is the rationale that we use to establish that Vancouver is in Canada. And that is the rationale that we use to establish that Vancouver is in the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Or, option 3, librarians would identify weaknesses in different evidentiary mechanisms. So a weakness would be that the rationale that we use to assert that Vancouver is in Canada does not take into account the continued legitimacy of prior claims to that land. So these different understandings of librarian for facts are probably easier to get behind. But while Egri's understanding of information as literatures embedded within institutional circuitry does provide a more robust basis for positioning facts in the context of information access, it is less helpful at understanding the positioning of librarians or other information professionals or whoever in relation to facts and their provisioning. While Egri observes that the presentation of librarianship as neutral and objective is a strategic choice to legitimize a certain form of information access, he does not propose that librarians should articulate their own positions regarding the materials that they make available. Indeed, Egri actually implies that librarians might continue to remain outside the literatures that they collect, describe, and provide access to. That librarians should explain these literatures but not participate in them. In this way, it's similar to Patrick Wilson's skeptical librarian, or even Bure-Yorland's domain analysis. To be for facts or for revealing institutional circuitry is not really to be for any particular facts or views or values or beliefs. And this approach, to me, seems ill-equipped to explain one vital aspect of librarians for facts: its appearance at a protest march. These librarians are for something else, in addition to facts, even if they maybe rather would not be. If facts are not objective, then being for facts is also not objective. So here's another teaching scenario that I find illustrative. Professional ethical codes for librarians dictate that librarians should not judge user information needs. And this is what Ager would call the professional ideology of information. It enables librarians to claim that they serve all users equally and according to each user's own system of beliefs and values. While this perspective seems compelling in the abstract, it becomes very complicated to maintain in actual practice situations. So as part of classroom discussion, I present students with dilemmas like this one. According to a user survey that you conduct, your library patrons request materials that describe childhood vaccination as dangerous, promote abstinence as the best, safest form of birth control, and establish biological imperatives for gender roles. What do you do? Very few students want to provide these materials merely because people ask for them. And yet, it is very difficult for students to articulate an honest rationale for their response. Students often provide justifications for not providing these materials like, well, if people understood that childhood vaccination isn't dangerous, then they wouldn't ask for information that is suspicious of vaccination. So I'm not judging them, I'm just helping them understand what they really want. If people really understood the facts, they would have different information needs. But of course you're judging them. You're saying that some kinds of evidentiary mechanisms are better than other kinds. And what this dilemma reveals, of course, is that information systems and services are always going to be for something, and that being for facts is no different from being for any other set of values. Being faced with this reality inevitably produces what can only be described as a terrible dread in the students that I interact with. We can all cheer for facts, but that apparently innocuous for is something else again. It seems so wrong, so biased. But as the current political landscape in the United States makes piercingly clear, arguing about who is or is not biased is a dead end. You're the fake news. I know you are, but what am I? Now, I have a response to this, although I suspect that my response does not sufficiently address the fear and doubt that my students feel. My response to this existential crisis involves suggesting how being for a particular stance on things creates its own form of informational value. And my way of talking about this is borrowed from a poet's appreciation of still life painting. So the poet Mark Doty wrote a lovely book about his obsession with this still life painting, Still Life with Oysters and Lemon. Now, the lemon here is undoubtedly a very real lemon. It seems very lifelike. And in this, it is also a very particular lemon. Doty calls it a bravura lemon peel. It has this delirious, luxurious bumpiness to it. It is both a real lemon and an artistic lemon at the same time. And this quotation encapsulates some of what such paintings represent for Doty. A painting of asparagus, a painting of gooseberries, a painting of 5 shells arranged on a shelf. Exactitude, yes, but don't these images offer us more than a mirroring report on the world? What is it that such a clear-eyed vision of the particular wishes to convey? A way to live, perhaps, a point of view, a stance toward things. The particularity of exactitude is a way of being for something, in other words. And importantly, this is where the value of still life painting lies. If a still life painting weren't a way to live, a point of view, a stance toward things, it wouldn't be valuable. A still life painting has value because of its perspective, not in spite of it. In Doty's eyes, the particular exactitude of the still life artist is a form of poetry. And indeed, I read Doty's argument to suggest that all activities of description likewise express a point of view, a way to live, a stance toward things, and can be seen as poetry. However, many of these forms of attention in our everyday lives are so minor, so mundane, that their poetry eludes us. We notice the artist painting the asparagus, but not the supermarket worker putting the asparagus in a particular location in the produce section. We notice the sculptor accentuating parts of women's bodies, but not the cataloger putting a book about female beauty into HQ 1219. We notice the designer making the fancy shoe, but not the algorithm that assigns it to particular categories in the online retailer Zappos. It's much easier to see the art in so-called making from scratch as opposed to assembling pre-made parts. Doty's essay clarifies that assembling from parts is its own form of attention that equally expresses a stance on things, a way of being for something, a way of caring about it. So in ruminating on how assembly from parts, activities like assigning a controlled vocabulary term to a resource can be a poetic form of attention, I found myself thinking about the tiny old woman in this photograph. And she's my great-grandmother, surrounded by her 6 children. We called her Grandma. When I knew Grandma, she had made a particular choice not to cook at all, ever, as a result of a dispute with her husband, Phil. So the only hot meals I ever saw them eat at home were TV dinners from Swanson or cans of chunky soup. And this was the type of person that Grandma was. She had an iron will. Grandma was the type of person who, when playing Old Maid with her twin 4-year-old granddaughters, would mercilessly play to win every time. Grandma was a boss. Nonetheless, when Grandma was taking care of me and my twin sister, the lunch that she made us was always special, although it was always the same every time. Grandma made open-faced peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, always on pre-sliced packaged white bread with creamy Jif peanut butter and Knott's Berry Farm boysenberry jam with seeds. We each got 1 sandwich. She cut it into 4 pieces exactly the same way every time. After lunch, we could select a cookie from the red tin at the top of the refrigerator. The cookies were kept in the tin only to be retrieved at particular times, but they were packaged cookies, Nutter Butter or Chips Ahoy, or these pink rectangular wafers that didn't have a name. Lunch with Grandma was a unique experience forged through a singular form of attention, and it was all an assembly of pre-made parts. Nothing in that lunch was made from scratch. It was not like the bravura lemon peel of Jan de Heem. But it was Grandma's boysenberry. We had that jam at home and the peanut butter and the bread, but it was never the same. The way that all of the elements came together at Grandma's was a particular form of attention, made from putting things together in a particular way in a certain context. My sister still remembers it too, just like me, although all Grandma was doing was providing a particular form of access to materials that she didn't even make. Except, in some ways, the product, the sandwich, Grandma did make it, just like the supermarket worker with the asparagus, or the cataloger with the book, or the algorithm sorting the men's shoes at Zappos. Grandma made these pre-made things what they were for us by organizing and arranging them in a very particular way. So when I told this story to the students on my organizing information class last semester, one of the students looked at me aghast and said, "Your grandma made open-face peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? Like this was the sign of the apocalypse. Like an open-faced peanut butter and jelly sandwich wasn't really a peanut butter and jelly sandwich." So I find this reaction so instructive. Although I hadn't meant to, I had demonstrated that a fact of life that the student had assumed was similar for everyone was not so. There were different perspectives on it, just like the location of Vancouver. For some people, a normal peanut butter and jelly sandwich is open-faced. The difference between Grandma's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and the location of Vancouver, however, is that my understanding of the former is completely based on my personal perspective as formed through my unique circumstances. If I'd have had a different grandma, I'd probably think about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches differently. But of course, how could it be different with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? Surely we all make them according to our own tastes, often based on what we grew up doing. How could this possibly be horrifying for my student? But the horror, I think, arose from a broader realization. It isn't merely that our ideas of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are rooted in our own lived experiences and what we believe and value, but that the location of Vancouver is also so rooted. A fear that seems absurd in the context of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches seems quite rational in the context of Vancouver. Oh dear, what if I accidentally impose my worldview on the information that I provide in a professional capacity to other people? Whatever I might personally believe and value shouldn't matter. I should provide facts, as Luciano Floridi might describe librarians for facts. Or maybe I should enable people to make decisions on what constitutes facts by documenting the evidentiary basis under which facts are constructed, as Phil Agri might describe librarians for facts. I shouldn't have a personal stake in what facts might be. That's not my decision to make. And of course, this position arises from an idealistic impulse to respect user autonomy and enable users' own decisions regarding information utility and credibility. But it misrepresents reality. I mean, as many have expressed, the ideal of neutrality is false. More though, as philosopher of science Donna Haraway emphasizes, the supposed neutral position is not just impossible, it's insidious. To say that you are for enabling people to make their own decisions with no regard for your own values and beliefs is either unforgivably, willfully naive or consciously manipulative, because there's no way to accomplish that goal. Striving for the traditional notion of objectivity isn't like tilting at windmills, noble but harmless. In other words, it's not just absurd to imagine a common sense, obvious, consensual way of making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It's dangerous. And this may sound disturbingly like Kellyanne Conway, but science is objective in the same way that Fox News is objective. It's a group of people endorsing a certain set of evidentiary standards as being appropriate for certain purposes. The only way out of meaningless battles over being more true is to make a stand, to have a stake, to be for something that you believe in and value. And so why should this make us recoil in horror? The particularity of exactitude is what we value in the still life artist after all. The lemon peel's delirious bumpiness, or the lemon peel's ethereal smoothness. The sandwiches that our grandmas made for us, different as they are. The facts that we create through our many decisions about how to implement, maintain, and use information systems. The facts that we care about, the facts that we choose to make for reasons that we are not afraid to proclaim. If we are for science, it's not because science is facts. It's because we value and believe in the evidentiary procedures that science currently endorses. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm talking about we, and that is precisely what each of us cannot take for granted. What are we for, and who is this we anyway? Well, these are conversations, and they're conversations that I think need to begin with painting our own lemon peels and signing our names to them. In other words, if the question that maybe we want to talk about is, well, what are we for? Then the initial question for all of us needs to be, what are you for? How do you paint your lemon peel? So I'm going to end by talking about how I see the lemon peel these days in terms of information access, what I think information access should be for. I think that information access is hard work. It's difficult. And it does no good to pretend that it's simple and easy and automatic when it's hard work, and it should be hard work. So the information scientist Julian Warner wrote a book called Human Information Retrieval that attempts to delineate different kinds of labor involved in seeking information. And the book is great, but it's like terrible to read. Like, it's so abstruse. It's like, I've tried to have students read it and they're like, I find its basic argument, in fact, to be very simple. And this is it. Retrieval involves multiple kinds of mental labor, some of which is syntactical or pattern matching, others of which is semantic, involving meaning and judgment. So search engines like Google automate the syntactic labor of retrieval. And as I talk here, I'm going to show some everyday typical examples of this syntactic labor that Google excels at. In these kinds of results, though, most of the semantic labor, the work of discriminating between documents and appraising them in relation to one's goals, remains incumbent on the searcher. The searcher performs all of the work of interpreting, assessing, and selecting between results. And this is, in fact, the hard work. And the search engine pretty much does none of it, nor does it help you with it. And here is the even more insidious aspect, which is not Warner's emphasis, but my own. The rhetoric behind search engines is that they do all of the work, that they're easy to use, that information retrieval is easy because Google magically finds the right answer for you. And so what happens? Well, often the hard work, the work of interpretation, assessment, selection, and judgment just remains undone. Of the first few results, we grab the one that seems reasonable and go with it because it's probably fine, and who has the time to waste assessing and selecting between search results? And sometimes we do spend time with selection labor, but it's not joyful work. And I, at least, often feel like I shouldn't be doing it. It's like not something that anyone values. Instead of hard work, useful work, assessing and selecting between search results seems like wasted effort, taking time away from the real work, the real stuff that I should be doing, as if the process of understanding and assessing what might be said about anything, even something as apparently simple as what's going on in my town this weekend, or where is Vancouver, is not real work. So what am I for? I'm for rehabilitating the human effort associated with information access. That effort is not wasted. It's necessary and valuable, and performing it contributes to our well-being as individuals and as a society. I also believe that the hard work of information access is always provisional and somewhat uncertain, especially when it most seems certain and stable. Right now, all sources point to Vancouver being in Canada. Well, this Vancouver anyway, unless we already have some inkling that this might not be the entire story. And I especially feel the need to embrace uncertainty with regard to data and society's current fascination with data. There was a very scary essay this past summer in the New York Times by Kai-Fu Lee, in which he describes the uptake of neural networks set loose on piles of data as a foregone eventuality in the corporate world. One of Lee's examples is loan processing, with new forms of artificial intelligence and appropriate data, human loan officers are totally unnecessary. A computer is much better equipped to provide decisions on credit worthiness to the satisfaction of the lender. The kinds of artificial intelligence described by Lee are built to deliver certainty of profits. And in Lee's opinion, they will do so. It's not might, it's not could, it's will. And so that's not even the point. That's just like the starting point for his essay. Most of his essay concerns how society might cope with the rampant inequality that will result from so many people being professionally displaced by artificial intelligence. His remedy is to tax the corporations making these huge profits and then redistribute the wealth. But the starting point that AI will take over these roles is not questioned by him at all. So this essay made me think of the classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. The certainty of AI delivers profits and the dystopia of Pottersville. In Lee's essay, the way to avoid Pottersville is to redistribute the wealth, to use some of its profits to provide basic welfare. But in the movie, the lovely town of Bedford Falls survives because of its hero, George Bailey, who embraces the uncertainty of humanity. Accepting uncertainty gives George Bailey compassion, and his compassion saves the day. So here's what I'm for, and it's not facts. I'm for information access that is honestly difficult, that values uncertainty, and that is created with and to serve compassion. What are you for? That's it.
While you have Melanie here, answer our question yourself or ask what you want.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thanks very much. It's fantastic. I have been thinking about statistical literacy and data literacy in the context of critical information literacy. So all this stuff about numbers, and it makes it sound like the numbers have the answers. You just figure out how to use machines that chew up the numbers and sift them out very quick. But if you don't kind of know your enemy, you know what are these numbers doing and how they're used against you, then you can't think through them, and there's something totalizing about that. And that seems to nest somewhere in the stuff you're talking about.
Yes.
Can you comment on that, please?
Yes. So one of the unglamorous and not talked about parts of data science is the cleaning aspect, right? Where all of the messy stuff that doesn't seem to fit is taken out. And it's just the thing that you do to make it work. And I'm not the only one to say that, like, well, that's where the interesting part is. And I feel like that's one of the activities that, say, people in information schools can focus our attention on. Like, what is getting taken out when we do the data cleaning, for example? Or even just, and this is where, like, going from big to small data is, I feel, instructive. Because it's in a big data set that you can be, cleaning seems very impersonal when you just do it through an algorithm, right? As opposed to like having a small data set where you can see like what is actually taken out. So some things that I do like in classes, for example, I have a metadata class now where the class is together constructing a data set about a particular group of objects using a standard schema. And they are describing some of the same things and also some different things. And then we look at what they've created and try and think about, like, why do we have these differences in the way that we've done these things? And the class focuses on video games because they're very complex and there's a standardized schema for them. But the most interesting elements to look at are the ones that don't initially seem like they would have interpretive flexibility about them at all, like price. So no one thinks that price would be something that is different. But in fact, price is all over the place because it turns out that price is very contextual. It depends on a time and a place and a retailer. And when you start looking at, like, well, why are all these variations in price? Then you realize that part of it is because, wait, what is a video game anyway? And how does one version relate to another version? And so by, like, looking at where the dirt is, right, all of these other complexities come to the fore. So I don't have any answers for that, but yes, like, that's a place to look at.
Thanks, Melanie. That was great talk. And thanks for competing with whatever it is that's making that noise out here so well. I guess I'm also still processing lots of great ideas, but there are two things conclusions that I've come to here that maybe you can comment on. One relates to Wanda's question about literacy. And, in our profession, we've worked a lot on sort of trying to take ownership of this idea of information literacy. It sounds to me that what you said could lead to the conclusion that literacy is not really the right metaphor or the right label, because it implies that if you could just learn how to do it, you would then know how to do it. What you're saying is that even if you know how to, there's no really knowing how to do it, it's doing it, it's the work. It actually is a thing that requires work, even if you're an expert. So that's sort of one thing. And the other is that this obsession we have right now with fake news is probably taking us down a rabbit hole that is not very helpful. Those are some thoughts.
Yes. It's true. I hadn't necessarily thought of information literacy as having that connotation before, of like you learn a method and then you could do it and then you have the right answer. But I guess there does seem to be like once you learn about information credibility, then like you're golden, right? Like you can just but there are a lot of other kinds of educational metaphors that we can use, like even just reading, right? Like you don't just like learn to read and then like, well, we can all read the same thing and come to the same conclusions about it. Like clearly that's not true. So, we can find ways to reconceptualize information literacy to have a more robust understanding of what that means. And also to, look at it, yes, like as a process that gets meaning through the process itself and not just the output of it, which I feel like is not something that we do a good job of, because even, as I said, like even for myself, I'm like, what am I doing? I just wasted an hour looking for something. Oh my God, just so wrong. And yes, I feel like every morning when I read the newspaper, I get so angry. Of course, right? But part of it isn't just, it's not just the political situation. It's the way that the popular press talks about all of these technology-mediated situations where it doesn't seem like anyone has a good sense of how they work, like how they really work. Like, that Google could possibly be unbiased, for example, right? Like if we just, like if Google just fixes their algorithms, then, or Facebook, then the fake news will be gone. And clearly that's not going to happen, and that I feel like is dangerous. That is something that is potentially harmful to all of us. So yes, no more talking about the fake news. Bad. Yes.
As a practitioner in the ancient alchemy art catalog, I'm really concerned about maintaining a factual context for the information provided to the public. And one of the tensions that we're experiencing around that is the increasing presence of metadata providers that don't share the librarian's mission, publishers and vendors. There's no way you can avoid using their products. The question is, sort of you get advice on this, how do you disambiguate that information without going all polemical and making your record say that counter-argument? Is there some practical way of identifying information that is proprietary, is trying to get this as opposed to that, as opposed to simply presenting the object as it is and
Well, I think understanding where different kinds of information comes from is a good technique. I wouldn't say that, so even something like the library catalog is of course not uniform. In my information organization class this Tuesday, one of the things that we were doing was looking at different subject headings that had been assigned for certain works over time, or and of course they're sometimes very different and not uniform at all, and some of them show certain different perspectives on what the thing is. Some of them show certain differences in how people understand the goals of cataloging, like either a few terms or a lot of terms, or understandings of what the thing purports to be. So one of the examples that we looked at was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a famous anti-Semitic hoax. It purports to be the minutes of a secret society who are of Jews are plotting to overthrow the world, and it's not. But those subject headings, like the older ones, don't mention anything about it being a hoax or anti-Semitic. They just say Jewish politics and government. Of course, that's what it's purporting to be. And the later ones say anti-Semitism, but it's the earlier ones that are following cataloging practice that are, like transcript. So, I mean, all of these things just go to the library catalog itself is full of all of these different kinds of interpretive flexibility. So we can't just say well, this form of things is, has a particular perspective underlining it. But being able to look at an ecosystem for all of the different kinds of decisions that are made in that, I mean, that's what I feel like is the way forward, as opposed to well, these are the good ones and these are the bad. Because who knows, right? What we consider to be good now, all of those catalogers who were making those decisions, of course they all think that they're doing good, right? They're doing things the way that they understand the proper way at the time. So it's hard to say that there's a right and a wrong. Yes?
We're